Okay, so today I'm introducing basic essay organization. This is something I always cover at the beginning of my English 101 and 102 classes for that matter, because students need reminders about how they should be organizing an essay. And these are like basic components that we need to generally be following. There's always a little bit of leeway with some of this stuff too, of course, but we need to like know these basics at least first before we can start to like shift into different variations of this sort of thing. Okay. And I have a couple of visual aids here for us to look at. I'm not very good with computers, so I like to use these. So first off, we have our introduction, of course, and there's basically like three parts to this. And you might see some different labels for these two, okay, but these are the ones that I'm most comfortable with using, particularly for English classes too. Okay, so you've got your three parts: the hook sentence, the background or context sentence, and then your thesis statement. Okay, and each of these can just be one sentence. Sometimes they might be more, like your thesis statement might be two sentences, for example. But I would caution against going a lot further with that for like the hook or the background and context, particularly the hook sentence. Like you don't want to spend a lot of time establishing that hook sentence. The hook sentence is just to grab the reader's attention, really. Okay, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can look up online for a bunch of suggestions for what to do for a hook sentence. Sometimes people like to pose a question. Sometimes they like to have a startling statistic of some kind. Those are a couple of common ones. But again, there are many, many options for how to start. Just make sure you're not doing like the same kind every time you do an essay. It's easy to like fall into that trap just because we're comfortable with that sort of thing. Okay, so make sure you look up suggestions online to get more ideas for that sort of thing. But it's basically supposed to grab the reader's attention. That's the first sentence. Okay, and then the next sentence should be background or context. Okay, now this gets a lot of different labels lots of times, but I find that especially for an English class, this is like the best kind of label to apply here. Because you're giving a little background on the topic, you're more specifically introducing the topic compared to the hook. Like the hook will like barely reference the topic, certainly not specifically. This is going to be more specific about what the topic is and the context in which you're discussing it. So like if you're writing about a novel, for example, this is where you want to identify the novel. Okay. If it didn't come up in the hook sentence, it might come up there too. Okay, so that's a good example of something that like needs to be identified for context here. Okay, or maybe you're writing an argumentative research paper and it's a topic that might sound like really broad at first with your hook. Okay, like maybe you're talking about internet privacy. It's like, well, that you might mention that specifically in the hook, but in the background and context, you get a little more specifically into like what actually you're going to focus on in regards to that topic, actually. Okay, and then we get to our last part of your introduction, and that's your thesis statement. Okay, the thesis statement basically states the main idea of the essay. Okay, and this has to include an opinion or claim of some kind. You can kind of see those terms used interchangeably here a lot of times. Okay, and it should also reference how you are going to support that claim or opinion. Okay, now you don't go into a lot of detail on that part here. Okay, but you do need to make some reference to that because the thesis is kind of laying out what the rest of the essay is going to look like, what you're going to be focusing on. Okay, and each of your subsequent body paragraphs are going to have to relate back to this thesis statement here. Okay, so this is why we want to reference how you're going to support that opinion because that kind of lays out what you're going to be doing in the rest of the paper, right? Like, yeah, of course you state your claim or opinion here, okay? But by also stating how you're going to go about proving that, that's really laying the groundwork for the rest of the essay, okay? As I said earlier, this could be more than one sentence. That is okay. It can be like two, maybe even three, but just be cautious with that sort of thing. You don't want to go overboard with like explicating too much there and end up like repeating a lot of material in your body paragraphs, okay? So then let's get on to the body paragraphs. This is going to be the meat of the essay, of course. Okay, so I'll kind of just show like one part at a time here. So the first sentence of your body paragraph should be your topic sentence. Okay, and the topic sentence is going to state the main idea of the paragraph. Okay, And this should directly relate back to the thesis statement as well. Some people with a thesis statement like to do a three-prong thesis statement. If you do that sort of thing, each of those prongs, either those parts of the thesis, are going to be like the focus of a body paragraph, or a focus of at least a section. Maybe it's multiple body paragraphs for each prong, actually. Okay. Now, generally, like when we're at the college level, we want to probably shift away from that three-prong thesis. But like if you're having trouble with this kind of organization, if you're having trouble making sure your body paragraphs relate back to your thesis statements, then maybe you should start with a three-prong thesis and consider shifting away from that a little later on, actually. Okay, but that is a good way to like kind of make sure you're being focused. And if you have a three-prong thesis, your topic sentence for a body paragraph is going to be directly about one of those prongs from the thesis statement, actually. Okay, now this is why we said with a thesis statement you need to lay out how it is you're going to go about proving the claim or opinion that you stated in your thesis, actually, because those references to how you're going to prove it, that's what this should be all about here, actually. Okay, and we got to make sure that you are staying focused on this topic sentence throughout too. I've seen lots of examples over the years of students that just kind of shift away from this. They kind of lose focus on what it is that you're supposed to be proving. And if you have like a weak topic sense to begin with, then that's probably going to happen. Okay. But even if you have a strong one, I've seen students like shift away from that a lot. So we want to make sure that you've got a really strong topic sentence to start with that states the main idea of that paragraph, and that you stay focused on that. Everything else that you're providing later, that we're going to go over in just a second here, has to relate back to that topic sentence. Okay. And it's good to also get like a little bit of, peer editing or someone else just looking at your paper sometimes, maybe, to make sure that your topic sentence really does state the main idea and does relate back to the thesis, actually. Okay. And then the other sentences in your body paragraph are going to be almost all of them are going to be either evidence or analysis. Okay. So evidence is basically, can also be referred to as supporting details, or sometimes concrete details is another term that I've heard and used sometimes. And this is just going to be stuff that supports the claim in your thesis. Okay, so this will be, for example, it could be concrete examples, facts, quotes from a book that you're using, etc. I mean, there's other ways of looking at that, but mostly it's going to get kind of repetitive after this. So this is all info that supports the claim in your thesis. Okay, and that's what we have up there. It supports the claim not just in your thesis, but in your topic sentence too. It has to relate back to both of them, actually. And you should be kind of asking yourself that as you go along. Each time you present a piece of evidence, you should ask yourself, okay, how does this relate back to the topic sentence for the body paragraph? And how does this relate back to the thesis that I wrote too? Okay. And if you can't answer those questions, then there's a problem with the evidence that you're given there, okay? Or you need to think more about how you're going to explain the significance, okay? Which is what we get into next, okay? The last type of sentence that you will write, I mean, other than the last one, which we'll get to in a second, is going to be the analysis and explanation, okay? So this is another term for this is commentary, okay? This is where you are commenting on the evidence that you gave. Okay, this is where you explain how the evidence that you presented earlier supports your topic sentence and how it supports your thesis and how it supports the claims that were made in each of those, actually. Okay, and you can see I underlined the how, explain how the evidence supports these things, because this is where students end up struggling the most, actually. Okay, I think a lot of students have an idea in their head about how the evidence supports their topic sentence and their thesis, actually, but students a lot of times have trouble getting down on paper those thoughts, actually. It'll be in their head, and I think it's so obvious to them in their head sometimes that they don't actually write it down very much on paper, actually. But this is probably the most important part of the paragraph here. If you can't explain the significance of the evidence, then what does it matter? Then who's going to care about it, actually, right? You have to be able to explain how it's important. You give that kind of commentary here, actually. Okay. Now, the ratio of evidence to analysis can vary a little bit. Okay. Generally speaking, when you're writing about nonfiction texts, Okay, you will generally give about 2 pieces of evidence for 1 sentence of commentary or analysis. Okay, when you're writing about like a fiction, like a novel or a play, generally for each 1 piece of evidence, you will give like 2 sentences of analysis. Okay, now honestly, in my opinion, even when you're writing about nonfiction, you should probably have like 2 sentences of analysis for each piece of evidence. Okay, because I find too often the students don't do that. There's just not enough explanation thoroughly given. Okay. And then you would have like a final sentence in your body paragraph too. This can be called like the concluding sentence, or the, if there's going to be another body paragraph afterwards, it's the transition to the next one. Okay, it's definitely like the least important. And I wouldn't worry about getting like too caught up on that. Like it's much more important to focus on these things here and the introduction than that very last sentence of a body paragraph. Okay. And then there's also a conclusion too. I do not have a visual aid for that one because that is the least important sentence in your paper. Okay, excuse me. That's the least important paragraph in your paper. Generally, my best advice for that, to avoid just simply summarizing things, because that's a lot of times what students end up doing, is to just simply try to provide a new way of looking at the topic that you're writing about. Okay, maybe you try to make a reference to how this is like relevant to like the real world if you've been writing about a novel all along, for example. Okay, and then later on we'll start to look at examples of papers and outline how we see each of those different parts of the intro and body paragraphs in those examples too.